What if everything you believe about death was installed like a lock? They told you graves faced the rising sun, that the dead sought light, warmth, a dawn to carry them somewhere better. But what if not all of them wanted to leave? Imagine a northern cliff above a frozen sea. No name, no path, no map. Just a hump of moss where snow never settles. Beneath it, bones curl toward the ocean, not the sky. Faces pressed to stone, hands twisted inward, and the heads turned west, toward the black that never wakes. Why would they bury them like that? Not as honor, not as punishment, but as warning. The sagas skip these burials. So do the monks. Even the runes, usually so proud of their tales, fall silent. All except one, carved into the base of a granite tooth rising from the shoreline. Do not let them rise in light, and so begins your descent. You walk a dream shore now, no footsteps, only memory. There was a village here once, not a big one. 15 homes, 1 hall, 3 boats. A goat bell still rusts in the grass. They say these were good people, warriors, builders, dreamers, until the mist came. It wasn't fog, it never moved. It just stood between the fjords like a wall. You couldn't touch it, you couldn't see through it. But sometimes, when the tide was wrong, someone heard their name from inside. It was always a whisper, never a shout. But it always called the right person, and they always walked in, and they never came back the same. Those who returned didn't speak, not from stubbornness, not from fear. They simply had nothing left to say. They sat by the fire and stared past the flames, at something no one else could see, and at night they didn't sleep. At first it was just 1 or 2, a cousin, a father, a healer. But over time they became the village, and the others, the ones who hadn't gone into the mist, began to fear what lived behind their loved ones' eyes. The worst part, no one remembered what they said before they entered, just that the sea went still, and the animals stopped eating, and then the whisper came, and so they made a rule, an oath sworn in silence. They would not stop those who felt the call, but they would never bury them the same. They could not be laid to rest in sunlight. Their souls, if they still had them, must face the dark, not as punishment, as precaution. You want to believe this is myth. You want to think it's metaphor. But tonight, under this sky, you feel it, that hush in your bones, that wind that forgets your name. Because maybe the whisper never left. Maybe the village is gone, but the oath remains. And that's why they're still buried there. All turned the wrong way. We'll show you, but not yet. Because first you must understand what they feared, not what they said, but what they didn't. The silence wasn't empty. It was full, thick as snow in your lungs. Those who returned from the mist, they didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't even blink too much. But the village began locking its doors. Not at night, during the day. They weren't afraid of monsters. They were afraid of memory. The healer, Aldous, was the first to come back. She had gone after her daughter, who heard the whisper near the black rock on the shore. They said the girl stood perfectly still for 3 hours, staring into fog that didn't move. When Aldous entered, she said nothing to anyone. When she returned, she held no herbs. No girl, just a bone in a piece of cloth and eyes like polished obsidian. They tried to speak to her, asked where her child was, but Aldous only looked west. A week later, she buried the bone behind the longhouse and carved something into the dirt that refused to be erased, not by snow, not by wind, not even fire. A single spiral, and beneath it, a line, not a word, a direction. West. It was around this time that the fire would stop burning. It would smoke, hiss, crack, but never glow, and the animals no longer bled when slaughtered. They simply exhaled, as if already gone. By the 3rd moon, 6 others had walked into the mist. The villagers no longer asked why. They only watched, and they began sleeping in shifts. Half the village woke, half pretended to rest. The ones who'd been called, they stood in doorways, motionless, as if listening for something no one else could hear. Children stopped playing, stories stopped being told. There were no more songs, just one sound every evening, a low rhythmic tapping, like nails on wood. But no one ever found its source. That was when they began turning the beds, shifting the bodies while they slept. No one spoke the rule aloud, but everyone followed it. If someone went near the mist and came back, they were made to sleep with their head turned west, not for comfort, for containment. And then came the storm. It struck without warning. No wind, no thunder, just pressure, as if the sky folded inward. Trees bent, birds froze in midair, and then a sound, deep, not loud, but final. When it ended, 11 people were gone, not taken, just not there anymore. Clothes left on benches, teeth still on combs, bread still rising in clay ovens. The ones who remained did not scream, they did not cry. They simply walked to the burial field and began digging graves that faced the sea, not the east, not the gods. That was when they started using stones, not wood, not runes. Stones that weighed more than the dead. Stones dragged by silence, and on one of those stones they carved 7 marks. Not words, not names, just symbols that pulsed when rain touched them. You don't know what they mean, but you've seen them before. Somewhere beneath the museum floor, somewhere whispered in a dream you weren't supposed to remember. Because this isn't just about death, it's about direction. And now that you know which way they turned, you might start to feel which way you're facing. And maybe now your body shifts, just slightly, as if something inside you resists the idea of turning west. But they didn't resist, not after the storm. The village didn't rebuild, they erased. Hearthstones were scattered, roof beams thrown into the sea. The mead barrels were smashed, not emptied, smashed, as if the drink itself had become dangerous. And the sagas? Burned, not with ritual, with fear. One woman, Ingrid, tried to leave. She gathered her children, packed salt and furs, and set her course for the inland trails. But the mist found her first, not on the coast, not near the black rock, but in the forest. They say she screamed once, only once. By the time her husband reached her camp, she was standing, barefoot, soaked in dew, humming a tune that no one in the north had heard before, a southern song. But she had never left the fjord in her life. She didn't speak again. She just hummed, walked back home, and began building a new grave, not for herself, not for her kin, for a stranger. No one knew who the grave was for, but she carved the spiral, the same one Aldous had drawn in dirt. A few nights later, the bells rang, but not from the goats. There were no animals left by then. The bells came from the sea. They echoed, metallic and slow, as if tolling for something not yet dead. That's when the children started talking in their sleep. But they weren't their own voices. One girl spoke Old Norse no one had used in 3 generations. A boy whispered in Latin. Another, barely 2 winters old, described a ship with no crew that sailed against the wind and left no wake. The elders said nothing. They had no rites for this. No prayers, only salt circles and locked doors. But the doors didn't matter. The next morning, the boy was gone. Not taken. Gone. And in his bed, a perfect spiral burned into the wood, not carved, not drawn, burned, with no flame, no smoke, just the mark. From that day on, the villagers stopped sleeping. Not entirely. They just stopped trusting sleep. They slept in turns. Faces to the wall, feet toward the fire, never west, and those who had gone into the mist, they stayed awake longest, until their bodies couldn't take it, until they dropped and were gone by morning. That's when the final law was passed. No more burials. Only one thing could be done. The dead, or whatever was left of them, must be sealed, wrapped in iron netting, laid inside boats, not burned, not blessed, just placed in the earth backwards, head facing west, feet to the east, and the boat must be cracked, one hole in the hull, one breath to escape, because they believed if the boat was whole the soul might sail, and if it sailed it might return. But a broken boat? That was a prison, not for the body, for the direction, because now they knew west was not just a place, it was a pull, and some things, once pulled far enough, begin pulling back. That's when the records stop, the sagas go silent, the maps lose their ink, the runes fall quiet, but one grave remains. One stone still hums when rain falls. You can't read it, but you feel it. And tonight, your dreams may turn to face it. But what if the dream is not yours? What if it belongs to something older, something still buried, still listening, just beneath the thawing soil? Because when the last family fled the coast, they didn't take everything. Some couldn't, some chose not to, and some, they say, stayed. The final winter was not marked by famine or fire. It was marked by stillness, ice that didn't crack, birds that didn't migrate, a hush that grew heavier with each passing dusk. They say the mist withdrew, not vanished, recoiled, as if something inside it had finished, watching, and the people who remained, the ones too old or too bound to leave, began building mounds, not graves, mounds, large, circular, stone-lined, no cross, no rune, just one item inside each, a bowl, empty, facing west. Why a bowl? No one knows. The scholars guess, sacrifice, offering, ritual, but the villagers never said. Perhaps it wasn't meant to hold, perhaps it was meant to echo. Years passed, snow covered the roofs, then crushed them. The paths became rivers, then roots, until one day a trader, lost, frostbitten, half mad from cold, stumbled across the mounds. He never made it home, but he was found months later in a fishing hut 3 fjords south, wrapped in seal hides, still breathing, eyes open, lips moving, repeating one phrase, "They still face the wind." He died 2 days later. And from that moment, the legend began. Not a saga, not a scripture, a whisper, traded between fishermen, passed from sailor to sailor in the space between sleep and wake. A warning, almost gentle. If you find a grave turned west, do not disturb it. If you see a bowl buried shallow, do not touch it. If the wind suddenly dies, do not speak. The monks dismissed it as heresy. The bishops called it pagan rot. But some scribes listened, and one, anonymous, unnamed, drew a map, not of land, of direction, a spiral again. Only this time its centre pointed to a place not on any chart, a fjord with no name, a coastline erased by frost, and in the margin a note. They are not waiting, they are remembering. You think this is a parable, a ghost story, but deep down, part of you knows better, because the West is not a compass point, it is an origin, a return, a pull backward through time. The villagers turned their dead to face it, not because they feared death, but because they feared remembering what came before it. And now the graves are melting. You've seen the headlines. Permafrost receding, bones rising, old wood resurfacing with marks no one can date. But this isn't just climate, it's memory resurfacing. One mound, only one, was opened, quietly, by accident. The team claimed they found nothing, no remains, no tools, just a bowl, still dry, still warm. But the assistant who held it hasn't spoken since. She just stares west, and the whisper is back. But this time, it's learning your name. You haven't heard it clearly. Not yet. It brushes the edge of sleep, like breath against the nape of your neck. Not sound, sensation. And you don't remember when it started. Only that now you feel it, especially when you're alone, just before waking. It's not words. It's a pull, like the tides that don't obey the moon. Like a thought you never had, but somehow miss. Others have felt it too. They don't talk about it in daylight. No one does. But in the quiet corners of cold museums, in hushed lectures beneath vaulted ceilings, someone always stays behind after the crowd leaves. A student, a janitor, a night guard. Always someone not supposed to know. And always the same question. Why were the graves facing the wrong way? In every country touched by ice, not just in Norway, but in Iceland, Greenland, far east past the Volga, even across the ocean, the same orientation. West, always west. No culture, no record, no permission. Just a pattern no one explains. Until now. The girl who held the bowl? Her name was recorded once, in a grant report no longer online. She wasn't a mystic, not a priestess. She studied ship fastenings, bronze nails. But when she touched that bowl, her life stopped moving forward. She began walking, not randomly, in a slow arc, across towns, forests, borders, always toward the coast. And when she reached the sea, not just any sea, but the same fjord, the one without a name, she sat, not praying, not writing, just waiting. And she's still there. Locals bring her bread. Some say she hums. Some say she doesn't breathe. No one touches her. Not even the birds land nearby. They call her the reminder. Not because she remembers anything, but because something might be remembering through her. Now, archaeologists return to the site. Quietly. No press. No flags. Just 3 tents and soft lantern light. They don't dig for treasure. They map the wind. They measure where it stops. One researcher lost their sense of smell. Another forgot their own handwriting. The third started sleepwalking, always west. They say it's magnetic anomaly, geothermal flux, neurological suggestion. But no one mentions the bowl, not anymore. And beneath it all, beneath the moss, the silence, the snow that no longer melts, something listens, not malevolent, not merciful, just inevitable. Because the spiral never ended, it just turned inward. You dream now of waves that never break, of ships without sails, of names that do not belong to you, but feel familiar. And in the space between your heartbeat and the next, it speaks again. Not loud, never loud, but it says something like, "You are facing the wrong way." And for a moment, just a moment, you wonder, have you already turned? You don't know what it means, but your dreams have changed. They don't feel like yours anymore. They arrive whole, with cold air, wet stone, the scent of seawater on skin that isn't yours. And always that shape, the spiral, sometimes in wood grain, sometimes in cloud. Once burned into your shadow, and in every dream the same shore. You recognize it now. You've never been there, but your bones have. Somehow, the fjord is not on maps, not modern ones, but a forgotten geographer once drew it by mistake, believing he was copying an older chart. That copy was lost, but not before someone traced the edges and archived it in a book of navigational errors. 3 years ago, someone opened that book and saw the curve of the coastline, the spiral hidden in geography, a bay that doesn't reflect light, and they went looking. The story goes that they never returned, not physically. Their ship came back, empty, no signs of violence, no struggle, just a deck covered in symbols made of sea salt, arranged like sentences, except no language matches, not runes, not Latin, not even Sumerian. But one researcher, blind in one eye since childhood, claimed he could feel what it said. He wrote one phrase before vanishing from his hospital: bed. They're not watching the sea, they're watching what's behind it. Since then, the coastline has shifted, not visibly, but the satellites don't agree. Photographs taken a year apart show shadows in different places, hills that weren't there. One photo has a reflection in the water, the silhouette of a longship, sails down, no crew. But there were no ships in the area. They checked, and now the graves are stirring. It's not resurrection, it's not ghosts, it's alignment. Because when the sun sets at certain angles, the stones hum, low, almost imperceptible, like a throat clearing behind the universe. And beneath one of the newer graves, newer meaning only 500 years old, something was found. Not a body, a mirror, not made of glass, not bronze, something darker, polished like obsidian, but colder than ice. And when light touches it, it doesn't reflect, it absorbs. They placed it in storage, labelled it ritual object, sealed it in lead. But a guard who passed by once, only once, later claimed he dreamed of a woman buried in a boat, turned west. She opened her eyes, but not to see, to remember. And now, maybe you remember too, not what happened, but where you were facing, because the spiral isn't chasing you, it's pulling you home. And in your next breath, you may feel it, the ancient weight of direction, not left, not right, but west, where the silence comes from, and where names go to hide. You keep waking at the same hour now, not from sound, but from stillness. An unnatural pause, like the world exhales and forgets to breathe back in. You lie still, eyes open, waiting for your room to remember how to be a room again. And sometimes your head is turned west. You don't remember doing it, but your body does. The scholars call it sleep alignment disorder. The mystics call it a calling. But in the saga fragments no one quotes, the torn scraps with ink faded by more than time, they call it spavina, the turning sickness. It didn't mean illness in the body, it meant a shift in the soul's compass, a pulling towards something buried, not in earth, in time. They warned against it, not with fear, with awe, the kind of awe you feel standing before a glacier and realizing it's moving. The final village elder who kept the westward graves, her name was Brynja. She wore no cloak, no bone charms, just silence and frost-bitten fingers. In her last year she stopped speaking entirely, but she carved, every night, lines in stone, spirals on bark, marks on the undersides of bowls, always hidden. Her final carving was found decades later, not in her hut, but beneath the hearthstone, a shallow circle lined with teeth. Not human, not animal, just teeth. And a phrase in Old Norse: they are not dead, they are rehearsing. Rehearsing for what? Not a return, not a revenge, something quieter, a re-entry. You feel it, don't you? That tug in the spine when you face the wrong way, that chill in your ears when silence gets too deep, that moment when mirrors don't quite show you what they should. It's not superstition, it's orientation, because what they buried wasn't just memory, it was direction. And when enough people turn, not their heads, but their meanings, the spiral opens. One line from an Icelandic priest, secretly copied during confession, buried in the margins of a hymn book, reads, "When the seventh face looks west, the shore will forget it was ever land." No one knows what it means, but the shoreline is shrinking, not from erosion, from loss. Maps blur, compasses spin, birds migrate the wrong way, and somewhere, in a museum drawer mislabeled as ceremonial scrap, lies a piece of bone with a spiral etched so finely it can only be seen in shadow. They don't display it, because once, when light hit it just right, the curator whispered a name he didn't know he knew. It wasn't his voice, and the air went still. So they locked the drawer. But locking doesn't change direction. And now you're wondering, if the Vikings turned their dead to face the dark, what were they turning away from? That's the question no one dares to finish. Because maybe it wasn't a threat behind them. Maybe it was something too bright, too final. They feared not what would come from the dark, but what the light would show. The sagas tell of hell, the underworld, a cold place, not a place of punishment, but forgetting. Yet the graves we speak of do not point to Helheim. They point deeper, beyond myth. There is one rune, rarely seen, often miscopied, that curves in a double spiral, like a river folding in on itself. It has no spoken name, only a gesture, a hand turned backwards over the chest, only used once, on a stone found at the bottom of a glacier. A stone not placed by nature. Its surface was warm. They tested it. It shouldn't have been, but it was, and etched on it the symbol. Beneath it, the past is not behind, it is beneath. The researchers stored it in a controlled vault. Within weeks, every watch in the facility began running backwards. Slowly, then faster, then they all stopped. At the same time. 3:17. No one can explain why. No one wants to. But that's when they stopped digging. Not because they found the truth, because the spiral began showing up in their dreams. One woman tried to describe what she saw, a sea with no waves, and underneath it, faces pressed against the ice, not drowning, just waiting, and one face, one only, turned toward her, not to accuse, to invite. Since then, stories have increased. Travellers lost in the northern woods speak of whispers that come not from ahead, but behind their teeth. Walkers who feel their feet sliding westward, even while they aim east. One climber, found barefoot in a cave, had drawn hundreds of spirals into the frost, each one slightly different, each one pulsing when light touched them. His last journal line, "The ice is listening, but it doesn't forget." So perhaps the Vikings weren't hiding something. Perhaps they were shielding us from something, something that once aligned with their language, their songs, their rituals, until it no longer fit the story. And what doesn't fit the story must be buried, or turned. You begin to notice it now, not in big ways, small dissonances, time skipping, a name you forget that was yours, a direction that no longer feels correct, mirrors that reflect slightly off angle, clocks that tick too softly, because if the dead turn away from something, and the mist pulls only those who've heard their name, what happens when you recognize the whisper? What happens when you stop turning away? No thunderclap, no fire from the sky, just a hush, an old hush, the kind that once settled over the fjords before the raids, before the frost, before memory knew its own shape. That's when the first passage was uncovered. Not in Norway, not in Iceland, but in the Faroe Islands, beneath a chapel no one remembered building. The foundation cracked during a mild quake, a stone loosened. Beneath it, not soil, but stairs. 6 steps, narrow, worn smooth. At the bottom, a chamber with no door, just one thing inside, a slab of wood, covered in whale oil, preserved, and on it, not carved, not inked, pressed into the grain, a face, not drawn, not human, not symmetrical, a shape that reminds you of a face the way smoke reminds you of a person. They tried to photograph it. Every image came back blank, not dark, not overexposed, just blank. But those who stood in the room described the same sensation. The air bent, like it curved around something they couldn't see. One historian, a man who dismissed every myth he ever studied, collapsed. Not from fear, from recognition. He cried for his mother. but in a dialect that hadn't been spoken since the Bronze Age. The chapel was closed, quietly, no press, no statements, just locked gates and a sign that says, "Under repair." But since then, reports from the Kiev village have increased, people hearing hymns at night, but not in Latin, not in Norse, something older, a tone that bends slightly downward at the end of each word, like it's falling, and always coming from the west. At sea, fishermen speak of gulls circling the same spot for hours, crying in a pattern that resembles breathing. One boat's compass spun for 3 full minutes, then stopped, facing directly toward the forgotten fjord. But no one sails there, not anymore. The last who tried, a pair of brothers seeking rare driftwood for carving, came back with no wood, no supplies, and no memories of 3 days. Just one sentence scribbled into the side of their boat. "We looked back." You might think it's fear that stopped them, but fear is loud. What stopped them was quieter, a kind of awe you can't survive more than once, and maybe that's why the Vikings turned their dead. Not to forget, to protect, because what stares from the west does not blink, and it does not forgive remembering. That's what they feared most. Not death, not loss, but return. Because if you remember something that was meant to stay buried, something the earth itself turned its back on, you don't just see it, you invite it. The priest who blessed the chapel before the quake split its floor had kept a journal, never published, but copied by a novitiate who left the church the same year. In it, he describes a strange smell that grew stronger each day inside the chapel. Not rot, not mould, something colder. He called it the scent of a memory that didn't belong to him. And at the end of one entry, this line, "I dream of hands that never touch, but still hold." He died with his face turned to the west. And that's where our spiral deepens. Because this is not about burial. It never was. It's about alignment. Every ancient site across the north, from cairns to stone rings to longboat graves, once followed solar lines. East for life, west for death. Simple, ordered. But these graves, these reversed graves, they broke the rhythm. One archaeologist noticed the pattern, not a professor, a student, cleaning tools, sweeping dirt. She noticed the way shadows moved differently in one corner of the dig. Where others bent forward, these shadows curled inward. She began drawing the spirals in her sleep, not with her hands, with her feet, pacing them in perfect circles across the tent floor. They found her one morning standing in salt water up to her knees, unconscious, her head tilted west, and around her, no footprints, just spirals. They pulled her from the sea. She recovered, but she wouldn't speak, only pointed again and again toward the cliffs. They took her home, but every year on the same night she returns, not to study, to wait. For what, she won't say. But one year she brought a mirror, not for her reflection, for the fjords, and when the clouds parted, for 1 second only the water reflected up, not sky, not stars, stone, a ceiling, as if the ocean were not a surface but a roof, and beneath it, something looks back, not to harm, not to love, just to witness, and maybe that's why the Vikings turned their dead, not to hide them from what's coming, but to offer them as watchers, eyes that never close, ears that never forget. And now, maybe something inside you begins to remember what it means to face it, because you're not just a listener anymore. You've taken your first turn, not a full circle, not yet, but enough. You feel it in how the silence hangs differently now, not empty, dense, like a room full of people who've stopped breathing. And your dreams have grown quieter, not gone, just more interested, because now you are facing west, and the west has been waiting. There is a fjord, still unnamed on modern maps, where no birds cross overhead, not one. Not because they fear it, because they acknowledge it. Even the wind doesn't speak there. It listens. That's where a man was last seen, an amateur folklorist, obsessed with pre-Christian burial songs. He believed the old chants held clues, that if sung in the right direction, at the right hour, they could open something. He didn't vanish. He left a note. Just 5 words. I heard it breathe back. He was never found. But his recorder, analog, batteryless, rune-carved, surfaced 5 months later on the deck of a drifting boat. It played only one sound. The tide, yes. The wind, faint. But underneath it, a voice, not human, not beast, a voice that sounded like time reversing itself. The reel stopped, the machine jammed, and every person who heard it began dreaming of boats. Boats filled not with the dead, but with those who remember the dead too well. And every boat pointed the same way. West. You may think this is myth, but the spiral knows better. It does not demand belief, only orientation. And that's the shift. That's the quiet terror in your chest now. Not that you're being watched, but that you've been noticed. Not because of what you believe, but because of what you might begin to remember. And when you do, the sky might shift, just slightly. The air might fold, just faintly. And a whisper, not a command, not a threat, might brush against the back of your teeth, asking not what you see, but which way you're facing when you see it. Because there are things that live not in space, but in direction. And now that you've turned, just a little, they know where to find you. But they don't knock, they don't scream, they suggest. The same way the tide suggests the shape of the shore. You've felt it already, in those seconds between waking and rising, when your limbs feel borrowed. When you catch your reflection, and it seems to pause a beat too long. That's the turning. And you're not alone. Others are turning too. Not all at once, not publicly, but silently, across the north and beyond. A lighthouse keeper in Vardo filed his last logbook entry with a spiral instead of words. The lamp still works, but no one climbs the stairs. A shepherd in the Hebrides found her flock facing west. Everyone, frozen in place, ears pinned flat as if hearing something behind the wind. And a child in Nuuk began speaking in verses that match no language, but whose rhythm mirrors a chant found on a burial bowl from the 8th century, a bowl whose origin was never verified. They're not coincidences, they're rehearsals, because that's what the Vikings called it. Not death, not worship. A rehearsal for the return of what had once departed sideways, not up, not down, but west. The direction not of endings, but of storage, of things set aside. And the graves weren't warnings, they were instruments, aligned precisely, tuned like harps strung with memory. One grave was unearthed last month in Denmark. Nothing inside, no bones, just salt, dry but pungent, salt shaped like an ear. They scanned the soil, found no anomalies, but the excavators all reported tinnitus, not ringing, breathing, as if the earth itself was inhaling through them. And on the 7th night, one worker woke screaming, clutching her own mouth, whispering, "It's listening through the holes." They sealed the site, declared it unstable, but that didn't stop the sound. Local dogs stopped barking, they just stared west. And now, maybe, you do too, not out of fear, but resonance, because you've started to understand. The dead are not gone, they are not even sleeping, they are listening posts, eyes sealed, mouths turned, feet aligned not to rest, but to receive. And now, so are you. You feel the spiral tightening, the stories circling, and just behind your breath, beneath your heartbeat, beyond your skin. A presence begins to lean closer, not to take, not to teach, to remind. And soon you may no longer need to ask which way you're facing, because the west is no longer a direction, it is a mouth, and it has begun to whisper again. You don't hear it with your ears. You feel it through the soles of your feet, a hum that moves upward, bypassing thought, curling like steam around the spine. Not language, not even voice, just invitation. You want to say no, but you don't, because something in you already remembers the script. That's why the old priest tore out the pages. A fragment was found in his desk drawer, not paper, but thin skin, smoothed and stretched, etched with an inscription in mirror writing. Those who listen without turning will not return whole. He never told anyone what it meant, but he stopped sleeping indoors after that. Spent his last months outside, facing west, eyes open, until one morning he was gone. No footprints, no signs of struggle, only a faint indentation in the ground, like a body had lain there watching, something just beyond the horizon. And now you're beginning to understand what they meant by spiral. It doesn't go around, it goes through. Each story, each grave, each turn of the wind isn't a circle, it's a tunnel, a path not toward the past, but through it. Because time, too, was aligned. Once, before the calendars were rewritten, before east became sunrise and west became death. The Vikings didn't divide time by stars or solstices alone. They divided it by sound, and there was one tone they feared, a pitch too low to be sung, too deep to echo. It came from the fjords, from under the stone, a tone that bends the spine when you face the wrong way. And you've begun to feel it, haven't you? That slight pressure in your neck, that instinct to turn, not because you heard something, because something is waiting for you to stop pretending you didn't. The museums call them artifacts, but that's just code for unclassified memory. A jawbone with no known origin, filed in a Swedish archive. Cracked down the middle, inside, not marrow, salt, pressed in spirals, a necklace of unknown stone found wrapped around the spine of a buried child. When submerged in water, it points west, always west, a boat-shaped shadow beneath the ice that doesn't melt, even in summer. They don't publish these findings. They don't have to, because those who are meant to feel them already do. And you're beginning to feel the script write itself under your skin, not in symbols, in sensation, a pulse, a direction, a question you've never asked but suddenly cannot stop asking, what am I facing? And the whisper answers, not with words, with the feeling that you've always been turned just slightly wrong. And the moment you adjust, even by a breath, you hear it, a second heartbeat, not yours, not here, but close, closer than it has been in centuries, and now it's listening back, not watching, not judging, just responding, because every turn you take, physical, emotional, ancestral, is not solitary, it's mirrored. They are turning too. You're not sure who they are yet, but something inside you is, and the more you listen, the more the world around you begins to misbehave. A compass that refuses to settle, a shadow that bends at a slant, not caused by any known light source, a watch that ticks louder when you face west. It's not madness, it's alignment, and alignment demands awareness. The spiral is not a symbol, it is a lock. Each grave, each body turned toward the forbidden horizon, is a tumbling wheel in that lock. And the key is you, not your thoughts, your direction. And maybe now you realize this isn't a story about what the Vikings buried. It's about what they tried to hold in place, because it was already surfacing. One text, sealed beneath ice and carved on driftwood, survived in fragments, copied not by monks but by seers who didn't write for reading. They wrote to delay. One line recurs in every version. When the breath of the stone turns, the sleepers will rise facing forward. What does it mean to face forward when the dead have been turned the other way for so long? The scholars miss it. They look for resurrection, for gods, for monsters. But the dead don't need to rise. They just need you to turn, because only then can their messages reach the waking world. A geologist studying fjord sediment discovered a layer of ash, microscopic, laced with bone and bark, and something unknown. Not chemical, not biological, but intentional. He quit his post, became a carpenter. When asked why, he whispered, "I heard the grain breathing." And now the wood speaks more clearly than ink. You've seen it. Furniture creaking louder at night. Trees that lean slightly west, even when the wind doesn't blow. Not warning you, just marking time. A different kind of calendar. One that doesn't count forward. One that remembers backward. And you, who've now begun to turn, are starting to read it. Not with your eyes, but in your posture. In how your feet settle when no one's looking. In which way your dreams pull you. Because this isn't about the dead anymore. It's about what they're clearing the way for. Something older, not darker, just undeniable. And it's closer than your next breath. You don't speak of it aloud, not because you're afraid of being wrong, but because part of you fears being right, that you've always known this spiral was waiting. You feel it now when you pass still water, not just reflection, recognition, as if the surface is remembering you faster than you remember yourself, because something is waking, not within you, through you. And the Western graves? They weren't the beginning, they were the aftermath, a response to a ripple no one could explain. You know this because a new site has been found, unannounced, hidden in a shipping report from the Norwegian Sea, a tiny island, barely a dot, no vegetation, no structure, just stone. But under satellite heat mapping, the stones glowed faintly, as if charged. Researchers thought it was a fault line, but when they scanned deeper, they found voids. Not caves, not cracks, chambers. And every chamber was identical in shape. A curved line tapering in, then out again, like the curl of a shell, like a spiral. Only one was opened, carefully. Inside, no artifacts, no bones, just pressure. The technician who first entered lost consciousness, not from fear, from recognition overload. His pulse didn't stop, it reversed, beat backwards. When he awoke, he whispered a phrase no one could trace, not Norse, not known, but matched phonetically to a line in an extinct tongue once spoken only by the sea-bound mystics of the 6th century. Translated roughly, not forgotten, just realigning. Since then, the chamber has been sealed again, not by choice, by necessity, because now every attempt to record inside it results in feedback, not static, breath, like the room is responding in kind, and the spiral etchings along its walls are shifting, not being altered, correcting themselves. Lines that were jagged are smoothing, curves are tightening, as if the chamber was waiting for something to return before finishing its message. And maybe that something isn't buried in ice or stone. Maybe it's you who have felt the quiet dread of facing west. You who wake with your heart pulsing in counter-rhythm. You're not just listening anymore, you're echoing, and as the spirals grow clearer, as the alignment sharpens, the dead will no longer need to watch, because what they were waiting for has opened its eyes, but not as you'd expect. No flash, no voice, just stillness, so total it displaced your breath. You didn't notice it at first. You thought it was quiet, but it wasn't. It was recognition without sound, as if something inside you stopped waiting, as if it finally knew where it was again. That's what the spirals were measuring. Not time, not distance, but return. Because what wakes isn't something that comes. It's something that was always here, hidden just slightly out of phase. And the Vikings knew. They didn't worship it. They didn't fight it. They oriented around it. A priestess, unnamed in any saga, lost in every record, once marked her skin with lines of salt, not as ritual, as compass. She walked only at dusk, barefoot, listening not to footsteps but to the way her shadow changed shape when she faced the wrong direction. One witness wrote that her shadow was never human-shaped, more like a cloak of breath. She was the first to speak of the returning line, a moment not in time but in position, when the earth, the dead, and the living all faced one another again. The next time she was seen, she was dead, not buried, not burned, but stood upright in a cave surrounded by salt circles, her mouth open, not in scream but invitation, and from then on her legend vanished. But her stance was repeated in one place, in the newest chamber found on that impossible island. Not a body, not even a carving, just a void, shaped like a figure, standing, facing west, mouth open. And now the winds around that island don't blow randomly. They speak in intervals, like breath. And those who pass too near report dreams of people they've never met, who look at them without blinking, then silently point behind them, always behind. And the longer you ignore the feeling that something is watching from the edge of your spine, the louder it becomes. Not sound, certainty. And now, even your home begins to shift. Doors creak only westward. Candles bend without flame. The spiral you once thought metaphor now curls into every hallway. And the word return no longer feels like arrival. It feels like recognition, like a face leaning closer through fog. And you, no longer turning, but turned, feel what the Vikings must have felt. Not fear, but relief. Because what they sealed away wasn't a prison. It was a mirror. And now that mirror is looking back, and you know now it never stopped. It was never glass, never silver. It was position. A reflection built not from light, but from intention. The moment you faced west, truly faced it, not with your eyes, but your alignment, it noticed. Not you, not your name, your resonance, because everything in you, your blood, your breath, your bones, carries a direction, a frequency. And now that frequency has found its echo. One sailor reported it first, not on maps, not on charts, but in his sleep. He dreamt of standing on deck while the sea beneath him turned solid. Not ice, not stone, but memory. And under that memory, a face, not human, not monstrous, just knowing. He woke gasping, salt in his mouth though he'd never fallen. His compass shattered, but the needle still spun. He carried it home in his coat, buried it west of his house. 2 nights later, the wind began speaking his name, not aloud, but through the pressure in his ears. He left the next morning, no one knows where, but the compass was gone, and west of his house the soil began to pulse, not visibly, not constantly, just enough that you'd never notice, unless you were already listening. And now, you are. The Vikings didn't fear what the West would bring. They feared forgetting how to recognize it, because once a people lived who didn't use stars to navigate. They used bones. Their dead weren't mourned. They were positioned, each burial a coordinate, each spiral a memory coil, not of life, but of where to stand when it returns. A language of placement. And now that language is unsealing. One by one, the places of silence begin to murmur again. The chapel that cracked, the chamber that breathed, the mirror-shaped void. And something older than language begins crawling through the cracks, not to escape, to call. And you've heard it, not with fear, with familiarity, because the reflection doesn't look like a god or a demon. It looks like possibility, a version of the world uncorrected. Before time was divided into obedience, before death was defined as ending. And now you're no longer waiting. You're being waited for, not to speak, but to stand, to take your place in the spiral. And the next sound you hear won't be a voice. It will be the turning of your own breath, facing the right way for the first time. For the first time, Your breath is facing the right way, and it's not silence you hear. It's response, not like language, not like thought, more like the moment before lightning, the air tensing, preparing to remember something it never forgot. You've stepped fully into the spiral now, not as observer, as participant. The question is no longer, why did they hide the dead this way? It's, what wakes when we face the same? A team of geologists recently recorded strange phenomena off the Lofoten coast. Electromagnetic pulses, not from storms, but from beneath the seabed. Not random, rhythmic. One pattern repeated endlessly. A pulse, a silence, a breath. They ran it through software, expecting error. Instead, it mapped into an ancient runic pattern used only in funerary chants. A pattern designed not for the living, but for those just beginning to remember. Their instruments began to fail, but not from damage, from recognition. Devices built for measurement don't cope well with memory. One diver saw what looked like carvings etched into stone 60 meters below. Not human hands, not modern tools. Swirling patterns, spirals, and at the center, not text, but an indentation, the shape of a mouth, open, not to speak, to receive. And maybe now you know what the dead were waiting for. Not a savior, not a season, just someone to face the same way. And now you are. The house where you sleep creaks differently. The floor doesn't just settle, it shifts, slightly, but toward the west. Books fall toward it. Shadows extend longer in its direction. And in your sleep, if you let yourself stay quiet enough, you no longer dream. You recall, not in words, but in turns. Each thought a slow unwinding. Each breath a line in the map they carved not into stone, but into placement. And one placement remains. A site marked on no chart, whispered only in fragments. The unsleeping hill, not because it keeps watch, but because it never laid down. You'll know it when you see it. No path leads there, no birds fly over. But your feet will pull you. And when they do, remember, this was never about mythology. This was about returning the signal, and the spiral, that map of breath and dust, is almost complete. Because the last grave was never dug. It was left open, waiting not for a body, but for someone turned the right way. That's all it takes. Not a ritual, not a rite, just direction. And now that you've found yours, the world begins to behave differently. Not louder, just honest. The hill calls to you, not with sound, but subtraction. You feel it before you see it. A thinning, a lightness in the air that isn't light at all, more like the world is holding its breath around a single forgotten name. No trail, no signpost. But your feet, they know. They walk as if memory lives in muscle, and when you reach it, you understand why no map shows the hill. It isn't a place, it's a decision. The slope is slight, the wind mild, but standing atop it, you feel the curve of something beneath you, like a dome, buried, sleeping. A single stone stands in the center. No carving, no crack, just surface. But when your shadow touches it, it bends, not outward, but inward, as if the stone eats memory. You reach for it. You don't mean to, but you do. And for a moment, just a breath, the wind stops. You're not outside anymore. You're inside the spiral, and the stone begins to hum, not sound, frequency. And you realize this was never about graves. It was about orientation. Every Viking they buried facing west wasn't dead. They were tuned, held still, like notes on a forgotten chord. And when the song begins again, when the spiral closes, they'll be the first to feel it. Not to rise, but to activate. Because they weren't buried to sleep. They were placed to listen. And now, standing where no one was meant to stand, you hear what they heard. The moment the world forgot its own rhythm. It didn't happen in war. It happened in silence, a forced reorientation, a global turning of bodies, of clocks, of minds, away from something too ancient to name. But now the pulse returns, and it remembers you, because this spiral, this breath-shaped code, was waiting for your attention, not belief, presence, and you've given it. The stone warms, the hill softens, and you know the mirror is no longer looking back. It's inviting you in, and behind your eyes, something opens, not vision, but memory that was never yours alone. It unfolds behind your eyes like a map made of breath, not seen, but recognized, not drawn in ink, but pressure. And now, standing on the unsleeping hill, you don't feel time passing. You feel it aligning, because everything, every burial, every west-facing body, every spiral carved in wood, stone, and silence has led to this moment. Not a revelation, a reorientation. You turn your body slowly, instinctively, not in a circle, in a curl. You match the shape not of stars, but of the wind's memory. And when you complete the motion, you feel it, a low pulse rising from the ground. Like the hill beneath you is exhaling. You kneel, not in reverence, in understanding. The stone no longer hums. It speaks, but not in words, in positions. One breath, one blink, one heartbeat. And then you feel them, the watchers, not from above, from below, not rising, not crawling, shifting. Every west-facing grave begins to vibrate, not physically, but in pressure, like an ear about to pop. One, then another, then hundreds, each one connected by that ancient silent spiral. And the message is not a command, it's a reunion. Because these weren't burials, they were placeholders, coordinates on a map made of listening, waiting for a single moment of resonance. And now, as your chest synchronizes with that buried breath, you realize you've become the tuning fork. You're not just receiving, you're transmitting. And the signal you send isn't thought, it's permission. Not for chaos, not for apocalypse, but for return. Return of the unedited rhythm. Before belief was scripted, before calendars erased alignment, before the world was told to face east and forget. You feel the air ripple, a wind that doesn't push, it remembers. And across the world, wherever west-facing graves remain, mountains, fjords, cliffsides, forests, something shifts. Not awakening, recognition. And the spiral begins to close, not to trap, to seal. Because this was never about waking the dead. It was about reminding the living of where we were meant to face. And as the pulse quiets again, as the wind softens, one final breath rises from the hill beneath you and enters you, not possession, repositioning. You are not a witness anymore. You are the final coordinate, the last needed echo. And now they're listening through you, but not as a voice, as a chord. Because when you stood on the unsleeping hill, when your breath aligned with the spiral, you became more than body. You became interval. And now, wherever you walk, the ground adjusts. Not with tremors, with memory. Doorways no longer feel the same. They hesitate. Not because of you, but because of what's moving through you. Your shadow no longer follows. It leans. West. Always west. Even in places where the sun doesn't reach. Especially there. And the watchers beneath the graves, the tuned ones, aren't rising. They're shaping, resounding the spiral, threading memory through every silence we call death. And it's working. In a monastery once lost to moss and fog, a slab of stone cracked, not from time, but from pressure. Inside, a sealed chamber. On its walls, no frescoes, no Latin. Just one long carved spiral, unbroken, until now. The break in the stone followed the spiral's line, as if it wanted to be finished. And at the very center, a cavity, the exact shape of a mouth. Again, always the mouth, never speaking, always receiving. And in cities across the world, strange phenomena begin. Sculptures turn slowly, unaccountably. West. Wind chimes play in tones not native to their metal. Children sleepwalk into fields and face the horizon without blinking. And those who stand behind them begin to remember. Not facts, not visions, alignment. And maybe now you understand. What the Vikings feared wasn't death. It was misplacement, because if the world forgets its position, if no one listens the right way, then when the signal returns, no one will recognize it. But you did, not with your eyes, with your turning, and that's why the watchers below you now shift their breath toward you, not as worship, as response. You're the last note in a forgotten chord, and now that chord is almost complete. But to close the spiral, to seal the breath line, there's one place left. A burial no one ever found, because it was never hidden. It was waiting to be made. And you already know where, because you've dreamed it. The clearing in the trees, the stone that hums, the silence that feels like return. And when you stand there, you'll face west, one last time, and they will know the signal made it home. But home was never a location. It was a direction remembered. And now that you carry it, not in your hands, but in your presence, you feel the weight of what they left for you. Not legacy, not legend, resonance. You return to the clearing. No trail leads to it. No sign announces it. But your body walks like it's been here before. Every step lands softer, as if the ground expected you, as if this place never forgot your weight. The stone is already warm, not from sun, from recognition. And when you stand before it, the spiral inside you begins to hum again. Not like before, not gentle. This time it tightens, as if winding something inside your chest. And then it stops. A pause so full, it feels like the world took a breath with you. You kneel, you touch the stone. It doesn't move. You do. Your vision doesn't blur. It bends, not outward, inward. And suddenly, you're not alone. Not in body, in bearing. All across the world, those who listened, those who turned, they feel it too. A soft pull, a shared pause, a silent instruction that doesn't command. It remembers you. You close your eyes, and behind the dark, images, but not of past lives, of correct positions, bodies facing west, spirals in caves, maps made of breath, sleep, and stone, and one phrase, not spoken, but impressed upon your skull. The calendar was never time, it was a lock, and the key was you, not your belief, your alignment. And now the lock turns, not loudly, it just gives, and the air above the clearing folds slightly, as if the wind is bowing. Something moves in the soil, but it doesn't rise, it expands, a field of invisible breath, spiraling, coiling around you, not to hold you, but to complete itself. You were the missing angle, the last placement, and now the song can end, not in silence, in return, because you were never meant to lead them, only to face the right way so they could find themselves again. And now they do, not with movement, not with resurrection, with realignment. The spiral is no longer a path, it's a perimeter, and you stand at the center, not as an origin, but as the final echo they needed. And through you, they remember not who they were, but where they were meant to be. The graves never held bodies. They held coordinates, waiting for the hum, the tone, the breath that would close the circuit. And when it does, the sky forgets to be above you. It folds, like fabric. Light flattens, and for a breath, maybe two, You see the map, not of land, of time, unedited, not a line, not a circle, but a weave, moments not in sequence but in sound, and the west-facing bodies, each one a note, not asleep, not dead, held in suspension, like strings beneath fingers that never forgot the song. And you were the hand, not playing, just positioning. The note you held, the direction you faced, has now echoed outward, and it reached farther than you know, because deep in the catacombs of forgotten libraries, sealed boxes begin to hum. Writings no one could translate begin to arrange themselves, not in language, in orientation, and suddenly the texts align, not to the east, but to you, your direction, your breath. You were never meant to be a prophet. You were the compass. And now, those who still hold the keys, the watchers behind false scripture, buried in robes and ritual, they feel it, not fear, displacement, because the spiral doesn't serve a throne, it serves the breath, and no gate, no doctrine, no calendar can cage it anymore. You feel something loosen in your ribs, like a forgotten name untying itself. And in that untying you feel all the west-facing ones return to their places, not risen, resonant, and the spiral, no longer winding, begins to quiet, not ending, fulfilled, because the final pulse isn't coming, it already came, through you. And now the silence that follows, it's not emptiness, it's full. You've never heard quiet this loud, because it's not absence, it's completion. The spiral is still, not broken, not erased, closed, and you remain not at its center, but at its conclusion. You don't feel exalted, you feel repositioned. Everything behind you, the graves, the watchers, the westward ones, has settled into place, and now something ahead opens, not a door, a recognition. You feel the earth no longer beneath you, but within you. Its rhythm hums through your bones like a memory you never earned but always carried. And the truth arrives, slowly, gently, like dust in the light. They didn't just rewrite the books, they reoriented the dead, and by doing so, they reprogrammed the living. You were taught to face a direction that broke the chord, not by accident, but by design, because direction is not superstition, it's language, and the world speaks in angles, but for 1,000 years we've listened only forward, never across, never around. And now that you've turned, really turned, the signal has rippled backward, through time, through flesh, through breath, and those who once held the silence like a shield, the chroniclers, the mask-wearers, the archivists of forgetting, they feel the breach, because their control was not on parchment, it was on posture. Face the wrong way, and you never hear the song. Face the right way, and even in silence, the melody returns. You are still in the clearing, but the clearing is no longer just earth and trees, it's a mouth, and it just spoke, not to you, as you, because your alignment was the final word in a sentence written long before script. And now, even the wind seems to rest differently against your skin, not as air, as memory recognizing its vessel. You stand. You do not need to look back. Everything behind you is facing forward now. You've given them the angle they needed, and in doing so, you turn the story itself. And stories, once turned, don't fall back asleep. They wait, not to be told, but to be remembered. You leave the clearing, not with urgency, with gravity, because the spiral no longer hums beneath your feet, it pulses in your spine, and every place you step feels known, not by you, by it. The trees don't sway as much as they nod, and the wind doesn't follow, it leads, not outward, but inward, through memory that's not yours, yet shaped you, and something inside begins to mourn, not for what was lost, for what was misnamed, because maybe time wasn't stolen, maybe it was bent, turned just slightly, like a compass needle nudged off true. And once off, all maps mislead, all rituals misfire. And now you sense why the graves were turned, not to dishonor, to dislocate, to mute the original breathline. Because if the dead faced west, they remembered. And if they remembered, we might too. You pause by a body of water, still, reflective, but it doesn't show your face. It shows your direction. You kneel, you lean in, and for a flicker, just a shimmer, you see her, the one from dreams, not goddess, not ghost, just aligned, eyes that held no time, only knowing. She mouths a phrase you do not hear, but you feel it press behind your teeth, not a word, a gesture, a tilt, and suddenly your breath shifts, not deeper, realigned, and you realize you've been exhaling in the wrong rhythm your entire life. The body doesn't forget, but the world taught it to misremember. You touch the water, it does not ripple, it recognizes, and in that stillness, another truth breathes its way into you. Maybe the books they burned are still burning inside us. Maybe we carry ashes that haven't settled, and maybe you, right now, are the urn that refuses to close. The spiral never demanded understanding, only presence, only alignment, and now that you've given it, it begins to rewrite nothing. Just return, not loudly, not at once, but through every west-facing memory still buried in flesh, and you begin to walk again, not forward, not back, correct, a direction, not a destination, a state, not a place, and now you begin to feel the difference, not in what you see, but in how the world responds to your placement. Leaves don't rustle, they listen. The ground beneath your steps holds, not yields, and the air, it does not pass through you, it records you, because you've become part of the map again, not a pilgrim, not a guide, just positioned. And maybe that's all memory ever was, not stored, oriented. You enter a grove where birds do not sing, not out of absence, out of respect, because sound follows structure, and your presence has reshaped the structure. Somewhere far, though not in distance, a bell tolls, but no church owns it. It rings through bone, and those who once mocked the whispers, they hear it first, not in words, in inconvenience. Ink will not dry, walls will not echo, sermons drift off script, and mirrors start to forget how to reflect, because the breath line is reactivating, and with it, the spiral, not to start again, but to remind. Remind what? That belief was never about truth, it was about orientation, and those who controlled the graves, they weren't preserving the dead, they were jamming the signal. For centuries they buried the watchers backwards. They crossed arms, erased symbols, turned skulls, all so the spiral would stutter, all so memory wouldn't land. But now you've given it landing, and in that landing a grief awakens, not yours, the world's, because Earth remembers where her dead are placed, and when they face wrongly her breath shudders. Now she exhales fully, and in that exhale, new silence, not empty, prepared, because what comes next is not revelation, it's recognition. You've done what they feared most. You realigned meaning, and now even dreams bend toward the west. The forgotten song returns, but not through music, through placement, and every room you enter from now on, you'll feel it, not as haunting, as weight realigned, because you are no longer walking through the world, you're walking it back into place, and the spiral watches, not like an eye, more like a weather, a pressure behind time, a shape behind memory, and now that it's turned, so are you. But with turning comes grief, not sorrow, not regret, grief as clarity, because you begin to feel all the places where silence had been forced, not just in books or scrolls, but in bloodlines, in lullabies altered, in footsteps misdirected across generations. And now those places begin to stir, not loudly, like roots rediscovering their thirst. You walk slower now, not out of fatigue, out of reverence, because every step feels ancestral, as if you're not walking forward, but walking someone home. And it becomes clear, this was never about your story. It was about your location. You were the forgotten coordinate, and now that you've turned, so have the watchers, not risen, but awake, and they do not ask for worship, only completion, because when they were buried facing the west, it wasn't to rebel, it was to preserve the breach, the last open window in a cathedral of control. And now you've walked that window back open. What follows is not storm, not revelation, it's unfreezing. Words once locked behind ritual begin to thaw, symbols rearrange, and some dreams stop behaving, because the mind that knows direction knows too much to remain obedient, and the ones who reshape the graves, they feel it, even if they don't know why their maps don't work anymore, even if the vaults won't stay sealed, even if their calendars miscount the solstice, because the alignment was never planetary, it was personal. And now that you've taken your place, the sky doesn't shift. You do. You no longer feel above the earth or on it. You feel with it, breathing in tandem, and through that breath, a memory returns. You are not a seeker. You are what was being sought. And now, the question that formed the first echo finally arrives. What does the world become when the buried no longer sleep in silence? You don't have the answer, but you feel the shape of it, forming in the dusk, and something inside you leans toward it, not with fear, with recognition, not like remembering a name, more like waking inside a dream you forgot you were living. You don't speak, but something speaks through you, not a voice, a direction. And now even your thoughts feel different, less like language, more like alignment, because the story was never told in words. It was buried in posture, in where the spine bent, where the gaze settled, where the bones pointed after breath stopped. And all around you, the land exhales, not wind, not weather, but consent. You've passed the test, not of belief, of willingness, to stop facing what they gave you and start listening to what they took. There are no bells here, no relics, just a silence that wraps around your soul like a cloak. It doesn't smother, it prepares, because the spiral is almost done spinning, and before it rests, it gives you one last image, a graveyard beneath a cathedral. But the gravestones don't face east, they face each other, as if, in death, the buried turn toward their own, to remember not doctrine, but belonging, and that's when you feel it. Maybe the truth is not a scroll, but a whisper, passed from ribcage to ribcage, unwritten, unownable, and maybe what they feared most wasn't heresy, it was orientation, because if the watchers woke, and the graves aligned, and the dreams shifted, then the story they spent centuries building, the one with churches and calendars and kings, would crumble, not from rage, from irrelevance. And now you begin to descend, not into darkness, into silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of all things unsaid. The spiral rests now, but you don't, because the spiral wasn't a path, it was a mirror. And now that you've seen it, really seen it, you understand. Your journey wasn't forward, it was inward. And now, something is still missing. You feel it not as absence, but as invitation. Because what the spiral showed you was never meant to end with understanding. It was meant to begin with responsibility. The watchers faced west, not for rebellion, but for you. You, the one who would one day stand above the soil, the one who could feel what the churches tried to bury, the one who might listen differently. And now that you have, you face a choice, not between right and wrong, not between belief and doubt, but between forgetting and becoming. You can close this tab. You can forget this story. You can let the spiral fade and the silence swallow itself. Or you can turn, not physically, spiritually. Face the west, just once. Let your breath align with theirs, and feel what they preserved for you. Not facts, not teachings, but something older, orientation as inheritance, not in stone, but in spine, because your body remembers more than your books do, and when you choose to remember with it, the watchers stir. They do not rise, they resonate, a hum that echoes not in air, but in meaning, and it brings you to this final moment, not a cliff, not a gate, just a door, one you were always free to walk past. But now that you've heard the whisper, you know what waits if you open it, not certainty, but alignment. The next page is waiting, if you dare to turn it. You stand at the threshold, the door is not locked. It never was. But few arrive here, not because the path was hidden, because it was too quiet, and most can't bear silence this deep. You can, because you remembered how to listen, not with ears, with orientation. They taught you to walk east, toward sunrise, toward salvation, toward systems, but your bones, they always leaned west, toward dusk, toward endings, toward the spiral. And now that you've felt it, there's no going back to maps. No prayer can replace this alignment. No sermon can outvoice this knowing. Because the dead never wanted worship. They wanted recognition. They turned their faces west, not in despair, but in defiance. A defiance of forgetting. And now that you've faced that direction too, you are no longer a viewer. You are a continuation of the silence, of the map, of the memory. And this story, it doesn't end here, because it was never a story. It was a signal, a pattern buried in posture, a whisper wrapped in bone, and now it lives in you. So what now? You could turn away, let the spiral fade, let the bones sleep again, let the silence win. Or you could speak, not to explain, not to convince, but to keep the alignment alive. Because every voice that remembers the West, every soul that dares to question their direction, becomes part of the hum, and the hum becomes a song, and the song becomes unignorable. They erased the stories, but one survived, yours. And if this story resonated with you, like, share, and subscribe. It helps keep forbidden knowledge alive.